Oil City, Pennsylvania, was a small, tight-knit community where families felt safe, neighbors knew each other, and children played freely without a second thought. Crime was rare, doors were left unlocked, and parents didn't worry when their kids walked home alone. But in October 1992, that sense of security was shattered forever. Shauna Howe was the kind of child who made an impression on everyone she met. At just 11 years old, she was full of life, always smiling, always ready to help. She was a Girl Scout, a good student, and a loving daughter. She had a bright future ahead of her and dreamed of one day becoming a doctor. Shauna had a natural kindness that made people feel special, and she carried herself with a warmth and innocence that made what happened to her all the more devastating. Halloween was one of her favorite times of the year. She loved dressing up, going to parties, and celebrating with her friends. That year, she was especially excited. The Girl Scouts were hosting a Halloween party, and Shauna was looking forward to spending the evening with her troop. Before she left, she ran up to her mother, Lucy Howe, and gave her a hug and a kiss, as she always did. She told her she loved her, then turned and walked out the door. It would be the last time Lucy ever saw her daughter alive. The party ended between 7:30 and 8 p.m., and Shauna and her best friend, Joey L., left together. It was a short walk home, a walk they had done countless times before. When they reached the corner where their paths split, Joey turned right toward his house, and Shauna turned left. It was just one more block, just a few minutes, but she never made it home. At first, no one panicked. Maybe she had gone to a friend's house. Maybe she had gotten distracted. But as the minutes turned to hours, worry set in. Lucy Howe started calling around, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. The answer was always the same, no. She called hospitals, hoping there had been some kind of accident, but there was nothing. Shauna was just gone. Then a witness came forward. Dan Payton had been walking on West First Street when he saw something strange. Across the street, a young girl was walking alone. Then he noticed a man, a tall, thin man wearing a baseball cap. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual, but then he heard it, a scream. Dan turned and saw the man grab the girl and force her into a small red car. The vehicle sped off before he could do anything. Frantic, Dan ran to the nearest house and banged on the door. He needed a phone. He needed to call the police. But this was 1992, before cell phones, before instant communication. By the time officers arrived, there was no trace of the car. No sign of the girl, no sign of Shauna. The town was thrown into chaos. A child had been abducted off the street, in a place like Oil City. That kind of thing didn't happen. Parents clung to their children, terrified that whoever had taken Shauna might strike again. For the next 3 days, volunteers, police officers, and community members searched tirelessly. They combed through the streets, the woods, the back alleys, anywhere she might be. But there was nothing. Then they found it. A piece of clothing discarded in the bushes, a child's bodysuit. It was Shauna's. Investigators examined it carefully, and what they found was every parent's worst nightmare. There were clear signs of sexual assault, and there was DNA. For the first time, there was hope. If they had DNA, they had a chance to find the person responsible, but when they ran it through the system, there was no match. The lead went cold. The very next day, another call came in. A man had been walking across a bridge near Coulter's Hole, a remote area outside of town. Something caught his eye. He looked down, and there she was. Shauna Howe's body lay at the bottom of the Rocky Creek bed. She had been held captive for more than 24 hours. She had been raped, and then she had been taken to the bridge. The person who did this hadn't just wanted to kill her, they wanted to make her suffer. They had thrown her over the bridge, letting her fall onto the rocks below. Her shoes had been carefully placed on the bridge. almost like a message, almost like a taunt. Halloween was canceled that year. There were no trick-or-treaters, no decorations, no laughter. The town was in mourning. Oil City had changed forever. For years, the case remained unsolved. Investigators tested every suspect they could think of. They tested Shauna's stepfather, her uncles, and anyone who might have had a motive. They tested a local man named Ted Walker, a pizza shop worker who made young girls uncomfortable and had a red car. Shauna and her friends had always avoided him, but when they tested his DNA, it wasn't a match. The case went cold. Years passed, 5, then 10. Every Halloween, Shauna's mother wondered if this would be the year they finally found her daughter's killer. But the answer was always the same: nothing. Then, in 2002, a break in the case. A young girl was walking home when she was attacked. The man tried to force her into the trunk of a car, but she fought back. She screamed, and she got away. And when police arrested the attacker, they realized it was someone they already knew: Jimmy O'Brien. Jim O'Brien and his older brother, Tim, were well known to police. Both had extensive criminal records, and both were known for their history of sexual violence. But investigators had ruled them out in Shauna's case years ago because they had believed the brothers were in jail when she was murdered. But they weren't. They had bonded out just before she was taken. Investigators ran Jim O'Brien's DNA against the sample found on Shauna's bodysuit. It was a match. Lucy Howe collapsed when she got the call. After 12 years, she finally had an answer. The truth was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Jim and Tim O'Brien had kidnapped Shauna as part of a twisted prank meant to scare the town. But things spiraled out of control. They took her to an abandoned house where they raped her. They kept her locked in a car trunk overnight. Then they took her to the bridge at Coulter's Hole. Jim O'Brien picked her up, and he threw her over. She was still alive when she hit the rocks below. The trial began in 2005. The courtroom was packed. The town had waited over a decade for this moment. Jim and Tim O'Brien were convicted of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ted Walker, who had helped cover up the crime, was sentenced to 20 to 40 years. Shauna's family wept. Justice had been served, but it wouldn't bring their daughter back. Jim O'Brien showed no remorse. When the verdict was read, he smirked. Tim O'Brien continued to insist he had done nothing wrong. But for Oil City, it was finally over. The monsters who had terrorized the town were gone. Shauna Howe is still remembered. Every Halloween, her family visits her grave, leaving her favorite candy. They keep her memory alive. Halloween will never be the same. But after 12 long years, Shauna can finally rest in peace. Oil City, Pennsylvania, will never forget the name Shauna Howe. Her tragic murder left an indelible mark on the community, shattering the sense of safety that once existed. What should have been a night of innocent Halloween fun turned into a town's worst nightmare. It took 12 agonizing years, but in the end, justice was served. The men responsible were caught, convicted, and sentenced, ensuring they could never hurt another child again. But Shauna's story is more than just a horrific crime. It's a reminder of how fragile safety can be, and how evil can lurk in the shadows, even in the most unsuspecting places. It's a call for communities to remain vigilant, for parents to teach their children about the dangers that exist, and for law enforcement to never give up on cases that seem impossible to solve. Shauna's mother, Lucy Howe, still visits her grave every year, leaving her favorite candy as a tribute. Though nothing can ever bring her back, her memory lives on, not just in the hearts of those who knew her, but in the changes her case inspired. Let her story serve as a lesson. Protect your children. Look out for one another. And most importantly, if you ever see something that doesn't seem right, speak up. It could save a life. Shauna Howe may be gone, but her story will never be forgotten.
In the quiet stretches of New Mexico, where the desert sprawls endlessly beneath a sky too wide for comfort, an old camper sat alone. It was weathered, sun-bleached, and simple, just like the man who lived inside. Bruce Stark had spent his later years here, embracing solitude, but never fully surrendering to isolation. He was 72 years old, a man with a past, a son, and a life that had gradually faded into the stillness of the land. Bruce wasn't a hermit, but he valued his space. His neighbors, Bob Nelson and Ken Hamill, understood that about him. They weren't the type to pry, but they made a habit of checking in just to make sure everything was as it should be. His son, Johnny Ray, and his ex-wife still kept track of the things that mattered, especially the things Bruce himself might overlook. But no matter how many people cared, no matter how many friends Bruce had, the truth was he lived alone. And one day, in the vast, empty quiet of New Mexico, that loneliness turned deadly. On the morning of September 11th, 1998, Bob Nelson stopped by Bruce's trailer, expecting to see his old friend. Maybe a wave through the window, a quick conversation about nothing in particular. But that morning, Bruce wasn't there. Something was off. Bob knocked, then pushed open the door. It wasn't locked, which was strange. Bruce always locked it. The inside of the camper looked wrong. His glasses were lying on the floor, broken. His wallet sat on top of the refrigerator, empty. Little things, but they painted a picture, a disturbing one. Bob's stomach twisted. He stepped back outside, thinking, hoping maybe Bruce was just out somewhere. But his gut told him otherwise. He found Ken Hamill, explained what he'd seen, and together they went back to Bruce's place. If Bruce was here, they were going to find him. The land stretched out around them, dust swirling in the wind. It wasn't long before they noticed something strange. Beer cans scattered across the ground. Dozens of them. Bruce Stark didn't drink beer. Whoever had been here, it wasn't just Bruce. And then a knife out of its sheath lying in the dirt. A spotting scope, unfamiliar and abandoned. Signs of a struggle. Something had happened here. Something violent. And Bruce Stark was gone. Days passed. No sign of Bruce. His son, Johnny Ray, arrived, desperate for answers, but there were none to give. The desert was vast. People disappeared out here, but not Bruce. Not like this. Then Bob Nelson remembered something. A well just 200 feet from Bruce's camper. A strange thought, one he didn't want to consider. But it was there now, gnawing at him. Johnny Ray knew about the well, too. More than that, he knew something Bob didn't. The well was covered by a wooden box, locked with a padlock. At least, that's what anyone passing by would think. But Johnny knew better. The lock was just for show. The box could be removed. With a deep breath, they lifted the wooden casing away, revealing the darkness below. Bob peered in. At first, there was nothing but shadows. And then there was Bruce. His body lay at the bottom of the well, draped in rope. The autopsy would later confirm what was already clear. Bruce had been beaten before he was thrown in. But the most horrifying detail was this. He had been alive when he fell. He had lain there, broken and suffering, for hours, waiting for help that never came. The desert had swallowed the truth for 5 long days. But now it was time for answers. Bruce's family told police something crucial. He owned 5 guns, 3 rifles, 2 handguns, and now all of them were missing. His ex-wife had done something not many would think to do. She had recorded the serial numbers. Every detail of those weapons, carefully documented. Those numbers were entered into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, as stolen. If someone tried to sell them, law enforcement would know. But time passed. The case slowed. Days turned to months, then years. No guns turned up. No suspects emerged. Bruce Stark's name slipped into the cold case files, another unsolved murder lost in the records of New Mexico law enforcement. And then, in November 2001, 3 years later, something finally broke. A pawn shop in Albuquerque logged a transaction. Among the many items exchanged for cash, there was a .357 Ruger handgun. The gun was tested, traced, and then it happened. The serial number matched Bruce Stark's missing gun. Detectives followed the paper trail, leading them straight to a man named Edward Sedler. He had pawned the gun just 2 days after Bruce's murder. It was the first real lead in years. And when detectives ran Sedler's background, they found even more. A criminal history, drug charges, and a missing vehicle linked to a second man, Philip Lopez. The pieces were falling into place. On December 17, 2001, detectives confronted Edward Sedler. The moment he sat down, they knew. He wasn't innocent. He wasn't even trying to pretend. According to Sedler, he and Philip Lopez had spent the night drinking with Bruce. Things got out of hand. At some point, Lopez grabbed a gun and started beating Bruce. But Lopez told a different story. He wasn't the killer, Sedler was. 2 men, 1 dead body, and 2 versions of the same night. But one thing was clear. Both of them were guilty. 6 months later, Edward Sedler stood before a judge. He didn't fight. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Philip Lopez took a different route. He went to trial, hoping for a chance. But on March 5, 2001, the jury had no sympathy. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Bruce Stark's family, it had been a long, cruel wait, but justice had come, even if it was delayed. For Sedler and Lopez, there was no escape now. Their freedom ended where Bruce's life had. Bob Nelson never forgot that day at the well. The regret never left him. He wished he had seen the signs earlier, that he had done something before it was too late. Ken Hamill reflected on Bruce's life, thinking about how he had more friends than he probably ever realized. He had been a man who just wanted to be somebody, and in the end, he was. Bruce Stark's death was a tragedy, but it was no longer a mystery, no longer a cold case. The men who had stolen his life were behind bars, and the truth, though painful, was finally known. Even in the vast emptiness of the New Mexico desert, justice had found its way home. Bruce Stark's story is one of senseless violence, of a man who lived quietly but whose death echoed loudly. For years, his murder remained buried in the cold case files. His name just another statistic in an endless backlog of unsolved crimes. But justice, though delayed, was not denied. Through persistence, forensic evidence, and a single pawned gun, the killers were caught, convicted, and sentenced. Yet Bruce's case is not unique. Across the country, thousands of cold cases remain unsolved, families left in limbo, waiting for answers, for justice, for closure. Every missing piece, every overlooked detail could be the key to solving a case like Bruce's. And sometimes it takes just one person to come forward, one tip, one moment of courage to bring the truth to light. If you have any information about an unsolved case, if you know something, say something. Report it, share it. Help bring justice to those who can no longer speak for themselves, because no one deserves to be forgotten. Not Bruce Stark, not anyone. Justice may take time, but it should never come too late.
The streets of Los Angeles in the mid-1880s were filled with an unsettling fear, one that crept into homes and hid in the dark corners of the night. Women locked their windows, men kept baseball bats by their beds, families double-checked their doors before going to sleep, but for some it wasn't enough. Because Richard Ramirez was coming. For months he stalked the city with the kind of cruelty that hadn't been seen before. He didn't have a specific type, he didn't follow a pattern, and he struck without warning, slipping into homes like a shadow, leaving behind nothing but blood, terror, and the chilling mark of his evil. Before they became victims, they were people. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, and daughters. Sons. Jenny Vinkow was 79 years old, a kind woman who spent her days taking care of her small apartment in Glassell Park, Los Angeles. She had a quiet life, a peaceful one, until June 28, 1984. That night, someone crawled through her window. The next morning, Jenny's son found her body. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. It was the beginning of something dark, something horrific. By 1985, the killings escalated. Maria Hernandez, a 22-year-old woman living in Rosemead, had just parked her car in her garage. As she reached for the door, she heard a sound, a footstep. She turned just in time to see a figure, a man dressed in black, pointing a gun at her. He fired. The bullet hit the keys in her hand, saving her life. Maria fell to the ground, pretending to be dead. Moments later, the man entered her home and killed her roommate, Dale Okazaki. Within an hour, he struck again. In Monterey Park, he pulled 30-year-old Tsai Lien Yu from her car and shot her in the head. Los Angeles was in chaos. The police knew they had a serial killer, but they had no idea who he was. Then it got worse. Maxon and Layla Niding, a couple in their 60s, were found dead in their home. Their bodies had been mutilated. Vincent and Maxine Zazara, another elderly couple, suffered the same fate. But this time there was something more sinister. Ramirez had carved an upside-down pentagram into Maxine's body. Satan, that's what he whispered to some of his victims. That's what he told the world. For months, the murders continued. Old, young, men, women, it didn't matter. He broke into homes, shot his victims, bludgeoned them, raped them, left behind his shoe prints, and vanished. The city was paralyzed with fear. Los Angeles law enforcement was scrambling. The newspapers called him the Night Stalker, a predator who came in the dead of night, leaving no pattern, no reason. But the police had one clue, a footprint, a rare Avia sneaker, size 11. It was found at multiple crime scenes. Then a break. On August 24, 1985, in Mission Viejo, a young man saw a suspicious vehicle driving through the neighborhood. He wrote down the license plate. That plate led police to a stolen car and, more importantly, a fingerprint. That fingerprint belonged to Richard Ramirez. Ramirez was a drifter, a man with a troubled past. He had grown up in Texas, influenced by a cousin who had fought in Vietnam and boasted about torturing women. When he moved to California, his life spiraled into drugs, violence, and, ultimately, murder. The police released his name and photo to the public. Within hours, everyone knew who Richard Ramirez was. The hunt was over. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez took a bus to Arizona but returned to Los Angeles, unaware that his face was plastered across every newspaper. He walked into a convenience store, and that's when he saw it, his face staring back at him from the front page. Panic set in. He ran, and he tried to steal a car, but the driver fought back. He ran again, down the streets of East LA, desperate to escape. But the people of the neighborhood recognized him. A mob formed. They chased him down, hitting him, beating him, refusing to let him go. By the time police arrived, Richard Ramirez was bloody, bruised, and in handcuffs. His trial was one of the most expensive in California history. He faced 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The courtroom was a spectacle. Ramirez entered flashing a pentagram on his hand, declaring, "Hail Satan." Women wrote him love letters. Some even came to the trial, professing their devotion. But the jury wasn't swayed. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. His response? "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. See you in Disneyland." But he never made it to the gas chamber. For years, he sat on death row in San Quentin, filing appeals and waiting. In 2013, before his execution could be carried out, Ramirez died of complications related to lymphoma. For the families of the victims, there was no closure, no real justice. Some found peace knowing he was dead. Others carried the grief forever. Richard Ramirez was a monster who walked among us, a killer who hid in plain sight, a nightmare that haunted the city for years. But in the end, the same people he terrorized, were the ones who stopped him. Evil may lurk in the shadows, but light will always find a way to expose it. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, may have died behind bars, but the scars he left behind remain. His reign of terror changed Los Angeles forever, forcing people to rethink their safety, their trust, and even the way they slept at night. His crimes were more than just statistics. They were lives stolen, families shattered, and futures destroyed. Yet his story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear any face, slip through any crack, and strike when least expected. But it also proves something else. Justice, though slow, is relentless. It may take months, years, or even decades, but those who harm will always face the reckoning they deserve. The Night Stalker was caught because people paid attention. A citizen wrote down a license plate. A community recognized a face, and a city refused to let fear win. If you ever see something suspicious, report it. If you know something, say something. You never know when a small detail, one fingerprint, one shoe print, one name can bring a murderer to justice. The families of Ramirez's victims never got their loved ones back, but because of law enforcement, forensic science, and everyday people who took action, they got answers. Evil doesn't win, it never does, but only if we stand against it.